A man is walking towards you. He isn't running. He isn't shouting. He isn't attacking anyone. To most people watching from a distance, there may be nothing especially alarming about him. Then you notice something in his hand. A knife. Now imagine that you are a police officer, and this isn't a movie. You have seconds to decide what that object means, how close the person is, how quickly he is moving, and what might happen next. Researchers have placed police officers in versions of situations like this. In one experiment, officers faced an approaching person carrying either a low-threat plastic knife or a more threatening electrical knife. When the threat was higher, officers using an actual shooting response tended to shoot earlier, and the officers also underestimated the distance to the approaching person. The result creates an uncomfortable puzzle. The officer may be seeing something you don't see, but that doesn't necessarily mean the officer is imagining danger. And it doesn't necessarily mean the officer is seeing the situation more accurately. Something else is happening. The officer has learned to look at the world differently, and once you understand how that happens, you may start noticing the same psychological process inside yourself. A police officer often walks into a situation with a different question in mind. Most people ask, "What's happening?" An officer may have to ask something more specific. What could happen next? That difference sounds small, but psychologically, it isn't. Imagine walking through a parking lot at night and seeing someone standing beside a car. You might notice their clothing, their face, or the weather. An officer may notice the person's hands, the position of the body, whether the person keeps looking around, whether another person is nearby, whether the hands disappear from view, and whether the behavior matches the situation. The officer isn't necessarily consciously running through a checklist. Training can make certain cues more attention-grabbing. Research on police threat detection suggests that experience and training can influence visual search, attention, reaction time, and orientation toward potentially threatening information. And this is the first twist. Training that makes someone better at detecting danger can also make danger more psychologically available. The same skill that protects an officer can change what the world feels like. Consider what happens after enough repetitions. If your job requires you to constantly search for concealed weapons, sudden movements, aggressive behavior, or signs that a situation could become violent, your attention begins to prioritize those possibilities. That's not necessarily paranoia, it's adaptation. Your brain is trying to become efficient. It learns what matters. A firefighter becomes sensitive to smoke. A surgeon becomes sensitive to tiny changes in a patient's condition. A pilot becomes sensitive to unusual sounds and instrument readings. And a police officer becomes sensitive to cues that might precede violence. The problem is that the brain doesn't come with a perfect switch that says, danger at work, normal life outside work. The system can carry over. A 2026 longitudinal interview study of UK law enforcement personnel found that some participants described becoming more aware of crime-related possibilities and more hypervigilant in everyday life, including increased suspicion of others and concern about loved ones. That was an interview study, so it does not mean every officer experiences the same thing. But it illustrates how repeated exposure to distressing material can influence how people perceive ordinary environments. Suddenly, the title becomes more complicated. Police officers don't simply see danger where others don't. Sometimes they have learned to search for danger before it becomes obvious. That ability can save a life, but it can also create false alarms. This is where the psychology becomes uncomfortable. The brain is not a camera. It doesn't passively record everything around you and then objectively announce what is dangerous. It filters, it prioritizes, it predicts, and under pressure, that filtering becomes even more important. In one study of experienced police officers, researchers presented images representing different levels of threat. The officers were faster when judging images at the extreme ends of the threat scale than when dealing with ambiguous situations. Ambiguity is the difficult part. A gun is obvious. A person holding a phone is usually obvious. But what about a hand disappearing into a jacket? Someone moving suddenly? A person refusing an instruction? A nervous expression? A strange movement? These signals don't come with labels saying danger or safe. The officer has to interpret them. And interpretation is where experience becomes powerful. But experience can also become a trap. When you repeatedly learn that certain cues sometimes precede danger, your brain becomes increasingly ready to connect the cue with the threat. The question becomes, how quickly should you react when you're not sure? There is no perfect answer. If an officer waits until danger is completely obvious, the opportunity to prevent harm may already be gone. But if the officer treats every ambiguous signal as dangerous, ordinary behavior can become threatening. This is the fundamental tension: false alarm versus missed threat. In ordinary life, a false alarm might mean an awkward conversation. For a police officer, the stakes can be dramatically higher. That changes the threshold, and this is where another psychological twist appears. Under high threat, the goal of the brain may shift from understanding the entire situation to preparing for the next action. Research involving police officers has found that experimentally induced stress can influence threat-related decision-making, while other research has found that increased threat can lead officers to act earlier in simulated shooting situations. In other words, fear doesn't simply make someone see things. It can change what the person is preparing to do about what they see. Perception and action are connected. When your brain expects that something dangerous may happen, your body begins preparing before certainty arrives. Now imagine the same psychology outside policing. You don't carry a badge. You don't patrol a neighborhood, but you may still have your own threat detection system. Maybe you've been betrayed before, and now you notice small changes in someone's tone. A delayed text feels meaningful. A short reply sounds angry. A partner looking at their phone makes you suspicious. Maybe you've worked in a chaotic workplace, and now every vague message from your manager feels like bad news. Maybe you've been embarrassed publicly, and now a room full of people laughing makes you wonder whether they're laughing at you. The environment taught your brain what to watch for. Eventually, you may begin seeing the possibility of the old threat before there is evidence of the old threat. That doesn't mean your perception is imaginary. It means your brain has learned a prediction. And predictions can be useful. They can also be wrong. This is why one of the most important skills in life is learning to distinguish between "I noticed a signal" and "I know what that signal means." Those are not the same thing. An officer sees a hand disappear toward a pocket. That's an observation. The conclusion that a weapon is being reached for is an interpretation. Sometimes the interpretation will be correct. Sometimes it won't. The same distinction applies to us. Someone becomes quiet. That's an observation. They're angry with me is an interpretation. Your boss says, "Can we talk tomorrow?" That's an observation. I'm about to get fired is an interpretation. Your friend doesn't respond. That's an observation. They don't care about me anymore is an interpretation. The brain hates uncertainty, so it fills gaps. And the more experience you have with a particular threat, the faster those gaps can be filled. There is another important lesson here. The goal isn't to eliminate threat detection. That would be impossible and in many situations dangerous. The goal is to become better at checking your interpretation before acting on it, whenever time and safety allow. Notice the signal. Separate it from the story your brain immediately attaches to it. Ask what evidence supports the interpretation. Then ask what evidence might contradict it. That creates a small space between perception and reaction, and that space can change everything. For a police officer, appropriate training can help make threat detection more accurate and responses more controlled. For an ordinary person, the same principle can be surprisingly useful. When you suddenly feel certain that someone is dangerous, dishonest, angry, rejecting you, or preparing to hurt you, ask yourself, what did I actually observe? What did my brain add? And what else could explain what I'm seeing? You don't have to ignore your instincts. You just don't have to worship them either. Return to that approaching person with the knife. The officer sees the same person everyone else sees, but the officer's brain is asking a different question. Not simply, "Who is that?" but "What happens if this gets worse?" That question is part of what makes policing possible. It allows someone to detect danger before danger becomes obvious, but it also carries a psychological cost. Once your brain becomes highly trained to detect threats, the world can become a place full of possibilities rather than certainties. A shadow could be nothing, or it could be something. A hand could be empty, or it could be reaching for a weapon. A strange movement could mean nothing, or it could be the first second of something terrible. And the brain has to make decisions before it knows the answer. Maybe that's why police officers sometimes see danger where others don't, not because they are necessarily more fearful, not because they are necessarily more suspicious, and not because they always see reality more clearly, but because their profession trains them to live slightly closer to the possibility of what could go wrong. And that leaves us with a much bigger question than policing. Because every human being has been trained by something. Your childhood taught you what rejection feels like. Your relationships taught you what betrayal looks like. Your failures taught you what to avoid. Your environment taught you what deserves your attention. Your fears taught you what to scan for. And over time, all of those experiences can become invisible instructions running underneath your perception. So the next time you suddenly feel that something is wrong, don't immediately dismiss the feeling, but don't automatically obey it either. Pause long enough to separate what you actually saw from what your history is telling you that it means. Maybe your instinct has detected something important, or maybe your past has taught your brain to recognize danger, where the present moment contains something else. Because the mind doesn't simply see the world as it is, it sees the world through everything it has learned to fear.